welcome. Today I'm going to be talking about, not just about the book, but about parts of our book, Advocacy and Policy Change Evaluation, that really can inform evaluation practice. And I'll tell you a little bit about the project, which was a new one for myself and Claire. We were asked by Stanford University Press to curate the field of advocacy and policy change evaluation. And it had been an expanding field. I think my first involvement began somewhere around 2002 with a large evaluation called the Clinic Consortia Policy and Advocacy Program Evaluation, which had 8 years to craft instruments and develop findings. But for the book, we were able to tap into a 2014 Aspen UCSF Advocacy and Policy Change Evaluation Survey that we conducted with members of the American Evaluation Association. We had a reasonable response rate, about 7%. We also developed for the book 6 evaluation case studies, and I have a list of them, but we were looking for evaluations of initiatives that had key learnings and insights, and we were able to collect quite a diversity of cases. And then we had to do our legwork and look across the field of evaluation practice, and it had spawned quite a number of toolkits and instruments and reports and articles. So just bringing that all together in one place and in and of itself was quite a project. The other objective of this book was to really delve into the literature and try to bridge that gap between evaluation practice and scholarship, in particular the political science arena, public policy, nonprofit management, and even within evaluation practice more broadly. You have quite a wealth of knowledge, and we again wanted to bring that to bear. And again, not write yet another textbook, but really to sort of show how it could inform evaluation practice. What we'd hope to get out of this book is to advance individual evaluation practice, particularly in the areas of substantive knowledge of advocacy and policy, and I'll get into some of the definitions in a little bit. We also wanted to position evaluators to design appropriate and rigorous evaluation designs. This has been a little bit of a tension, and it's not unique to advocacy and policy change evaluation, but having standard, uniform practice. Also, we wanted to speak to the importance of partnerships with advocacy funders and decision makers. Sorry, it should be advocates, of course. And that's an essential component, which again is what you see in other areas of evaluation practice, such as developmental evaluation. We also wanted to support growth and expansion of the field of advocacy and policy change evaluation, which is an interesting dynamic about this area, is that it's had a lot of support from funders like the California Endowment, Casey Foundation, to really create a structure around the field as a self-identified field. So at the American Evaluation Association, there's the Advocacy and Policy Change Topical Interest Group, which has numbered around 800 people and what has been one of the fastest growing groups at AEA. I mean, ultimately what we hope to get out of this is, and this is the last sentence of our book. It took us a while to get to the most important part of the book, which is really trying to bring to bear scholarship, models, resources, and examples of useful evaluation designs and tools so that advocacy can fulfill its vision more effectively. So I'll just give a brief overview on policy and policy making, and the reasons there's been so much interest around doing initiatives, scale campaigns, strengthening capacity to work with the media, is that funders see that you can achieve systems level change and improve social and environmental conditions if you work through the policy and policy making process. But that said, most of us know that policy making is long-term, is complex, it can be uncertain, it can change quickly, and that the political context can make things sometimes very opaque and difficult to navigate. But luckily, evaluators come into this with a fairly robust foundation. They have theories of change. There is a body of advocacy and policy evaluation practice on which they can draw. just to give a little bit of an overview on what we mean by advocacy, this boils it down nicely, or championing or supporting a cause or a policy goal. But what we point out in the book is that there is no one definition of advocacy. Not that they diverge a lot, but that you have to ask the question of your stakeholders, what do you mean by advocacy? And there are different kinds of advocacy. There's legislative advocacy, there's media advocacy. You have to define your terms. And it's interesting when you ask this, what do you mean by policy advocacy? And you can get some different responses from your advocates. So we explain that in the book, that you kind of need to know that different perspectives have different definitions. And it could be different for the evaluator, the advocate, and the funder. We also point out that there's a broad swath of advocates, individuals, organizations, policymakers, social movements, and we actually go to great lengths to list them all and give you reasonable definitions. That's not to say that they all have an equal chance at being heard in the policy process, and we bring to bear some of the scholarship about the challenges, hurdles to being a successful advocate. And also we try to flesh out what are all the types of advocacy tactics that can be used by advocates to mobilize a community and advance a policy. And we're trying to be really thorough with our laying out of the landscape around advocacy, because this is where, as evaluators, you will go look to figure out what your outcomes will be, what your indicators are. And there's been a good amount of work to try to flesh this out, and we just brought it all together. We try to bring in work from the international arena as well. So it's meant to be a real resource. It's also a way to try and standardize our definitions used by evaluators, so that we report out, we all have a common understanding of what we're talking about. So our survey, which was a kind of a novel thing to do for an evaluation book, was a way to tether our book to what's actual practice, and then try to fill in the gaps. So find out the strengths and figure out where we need to expand individual practice. And what we learned is that, we sort of jokingly say, but it's true, that evaluators are kind of a scrappy bunch. They're very entrepreneurial. There's no problem they can't solve. And this was true. We saw pretty good use or adoption of new or unique instruments, and I'll tell you what those are in another couple of slides. That said, there's a fairly low use of experimental designs, about 6%, non-experimental is about 84%, and this comes back to the nature of what's being evaluated and the complexity of policy change, that it can change course, and that you don't always have a control group, or your sampling techniques can't be applied. This is where, as the evaluator, you have to really step back and understand what is being evaluated and get into the complexity. In fact, that's coming up in a sec. What we also learned from the survey is that there are gaps around policy areas and the political context, that evaluators will actually work in multiple policy arenas and multiple types of initiatives, and that so there can be a shallowness in expertise, but the shallowness is not just about the evaluator. It can also be about advocates and funders. You shouldn't assume that everybody knows a policy arena when you go in as the evaluator, particularly some of the denser or weedier ones, like Medicaid policy, for example, where I've done a lot of work. Very technical, very arcane. So, but that's where God is in the details in these situations. It's really where the crux is of critical policy making. And this shouldn't be news to us. There's a lot of evaluation, both in health policy but also education. But we actually did a list of upwards of 16 policy arenas where there's activity. And so what's interesting for us is to see where there are potential areas for growth for evaluators, particularly the environmental arena, where climate change is starting to take hold. And then funding is always the gap the concern that all evaluators identify. There's never enough money in the budget to do a really thorough, comprehensive design in this arena, particularly since it's got a certain level of uncertainty and how tactics will evolve, or how quickly they'll be replaced, or how the policy will evolve. So here's some of the data. Sorry that I don't think you can see these are advocacy tactics, and then these are the percent of survey respondents that focus on the tactic as part of their evaluation design. And what we're trying to do is be really clear on categories and subcategories. And again, this is just a sample of that, but we try to use both the literature and practice to say that mobilizing citizens and organizing advocacy allies is a distinct group from the other groups. I think what's really noteworthy on the slide is what has a lower percent of attention, like protests or demonstrations, voter outreach, litigation, to indicate low activity. And this is the area where political scientists are very active. So we're trying to make the argument that why not adopt the survey methods and results from prior research in the political science arena to support your evaluation practice. And we're also saying, and the field understands this, it understands that litigation in the courts, particularly right now, is a key focus. So develop the ability to do more work and support your advocates in this area. For a while, a lot of evaluation, actually funding and evaluation, was around upstream of the policy change process, around community organizing and advocacy capacity development. And increasingly, you're seeing evaluation all the way to program implementation. So again, there's lots of ways that evaluation practice can grow, both in depth and breadth. So our 6 evaluation cases, which I conducted those, we were looking for 6 cases that had something about evaluation design, not necessarily about the findings, not necessarily about the advocacy initiative, but about evaluation design. And I'm not going to read all the ones on the slide. I just wanted to point out that what's also nice is that we have a variety of policy areas represented, because this book was never intended to focus on one particular policy arena. So we have transportation, we have girls' rights, we have food injustice, we have old growth forests, healthcare, and smoke-free policies. And then we have, the way we set these up is that we have 2 midpoint evaluations, we have 2 full, both process and outcome evaluations. And we pair them up that way. We don't pair them up by policy issues. We pair them up a little more by like with like around their evaluation design. And in the book, we then kind of drill down and do that side-by-side comparison to see how they're the same or different. And I'll show you the dimensions that we report on. So working with the Tribal Tobacco Education and Policy Initiative, we first tell you what the strategy, the advocacy strategy and tactics, in this case it's very local level, capacity building, community education, but also support passage of smoke-free policies. So it's nice to have a range here, not just about capacity development. We tell you a little bit about the design, and in this case the evaluation started early and went to the end. Actually, I think the program's still going. So it's nice to have a formative and a summative design. They did include a logic model, and actually 5 of our evaluations did include a logic model. And this is a little bit of a point of tension within this community of evaluators, because it's actually is a very typical argument about logic models, is that they're too linear. They overlook the complexity. You don't always show the cause and effect relationship between outcomes. But we stress working with one, or at least working with a sequential logic model, just so you'll have a discussion about how the initiative works, and as well as structuring, figuring out what your indicators will be. So we encourage it. This evaluation, because it was with 5 tribes, they really tried to be culturally sensitive and use what they called a participatory approach to facilitate strategic learning. And strategic learning means to really try to inform advocacy while you go. So, and that's a lot of what the developmental evaluation arena is about as well, is where that partnership and that learning is ongoing, and it can help structure future evaluation activities. They used a mixed methods design, relied on triangulation, and I just listed the assortment of tools or instruments. And you know, many of these things are actually the same in the other 5 evaluations: surveys, interviews, site visits, and I mentioned the most significant change story, which is a way of doing a case study so that you try to get at both contribution and attribution. That is, you know, what did participants perceive as what led to what, and then what was the most significant change because of the program. So it's the qualitative approach to trying to get at attribution. And then we also report on dissemination of the findings, because actually not just in this evaluation arena, but throughout the evaluation community there's concern with the uptake of evaluation findings. And that is similarly a large concern in this group. So what we did is we took the 6 cases, we took the survey results, and we tried to, you know, craft some guiding principles. And I'm just going to run through them very quickly. We of course provide a rather detailed discussion in the book, but we really push on partnerships with the funders, advocates early and often and throughout the process. That the dialogue is critical. These initiatives are just complex and uncertain enough, and you're also in an arena where you have to be careful how you navigate, because you have the potential. You have to be wary, or I should say, concerned with the opposition. You have to deal with an unwillingness to disclose. You have to really be, and you also need to understand the dynamics of the political culture. So really partnering and not just looking at it from the outside in. You know, be aware. By the same token, that means you need to determine your role, and to the extent to which you are a critical friend. That's how we reference it. But for some, you know, there is a desire to be much more objective. It kind of comes down to what's appropriate for the situation and what you perceive as your evaluation practice. Again, just to reiterate, you can't know the initiative and its context enough. It really takes clarifying your terms and definitions so you're on the same page. We say embrace the complexity, don't be put off by it. And we try to provide instruments and ideas to that end. We're always trying to match people to the resources that already exist out there. It's like systems thinking tools. And again, just to reiterate, you know, really look at having if not a theory of change, then a logic model. And that also to build on the base that we have. There's kind of been a tendency to redefine, recreate a little bit, and we were hoping to get a little more standardization. And a part of this is a question of competencies, which are also under discussion in the evaluation community. And then this balance, attribution, and contribution, or prove versus improve. Again, this is not unique to this arena, but it does seem to happen quite a bit because it's hard to get an experimental design. And then this is the one that's kind of a sticking point, like, well, what if you can't get an N more than 5? Or and again, the real world evaluation arena, there's been so much work in these other areas to bump up the rigor for small samples, for designs. And that, of course, communicate. All right, so this is why we throw it all together in the book, or these areas or things that you have to put into, that you have to consider when you put your design together. Again, that you look to the inputs, outputs, outcomes, and we have a whole ton listed in the book. That you don't forget your evaluation basics, that you really look to the AEA guiding principles for evaluators, that you really look at other evaluation frameworks, particularly developmental evaluation, empowerment evaluation, You kind of want to cast your net very broadly here, even though at the end of the day you may still only have a survey, interviews, site visit, and a document review. It may come down to very few instruments, but you still want to put enough thought in these other possibilities for how you structure your design. And I think the field is going towards more quasi-experimental designs. There are some new ways to do, like it's called survey with placebo, as a way to increase the rigor of your instruments and your sampling. And then the methods and instruments, you have a combination of the usual suspects like interviews and surveys, but as you'll see in the next slide, the field itself has been really aggressive in developing new instruments. And that together, that's how when you blend all these elements and choose which ones you want, that's how you're going to both strengthen advocacy as well as grant making and policy making. So this is just this slide has a lot of words, but it's actually a very simple concept. We push on what's called the policy making stage model throughout the book as a way to frame your initiative. It's something that it's public policy 101. It's the idea that you can break out the process and go from advocacy capacity building all the way to policy implementation and evaluation. And we have different activities and outcomes for each stage. But my point is that the tools on the left side, or I guess the left side, they can actually work across multiple stages. That's why you can actually boil your design down to just a few instruments, because some of them have enough different categories that you can assess for different dimensions of a program at a different stage. So we provide instructions on how to do that, because basically you'll still have to be efficient at the end of the day. You don't have a lot of resources to work with, but there is now such a robust toolkit of instruments that can cover different stages of the model that you don't need a lot of instruments. So the role of the evaluator, just what we've been finding in our practice is that you may be called in to really work with the advocates on informing their strategy and working with the funder as they think about our evaluation with the endowment was a 7-year evaluation. We had plenty of opportunity to intervene and say, based on the findings, you might want to move from this policy or this strategy. And then the other thing you're doing, and we try to say, do this a little more, be a little more upfront that you're building evaluation culture, because advocates barely have enough resources to do the advocacy. But the other barrier is that they think they know how well they're doing, which is probably true. I mean, in many cases you're not really doing evaluation to train advocates, you're telling them how well things are working and whether they want to consider changing strategy. But most people who are advocates feel they know. So you have to figure out how to educate them to look at different dimensions. How might they monitor? What can they do internally? How can they rely on an external evaluator? And then working with funders, what we've seen is that this has been a field building enterprise for funders. They're looking to bring, particularly nonprofits that provide services, have taken on advocacy as a new function. So you have funders doing this sort of broad, large initiatives, and this represents a significant piece of their portfolio. So you're advising them on how that portfolio might evolve, or doing retrospective studies to tell them how well their 10-year initiative did in these issue areas around adolescent health or tobacco cessation. And this area, educating decision makers, and this typically falls into what's called policy evaluation, but truth be told, your findings are coming out at the same time that these issues and tactics are being deliberated. So we just say you might not be intending to inform decision making, but your materials are out there, and we would actually package our materials so that advocates could use them. Case studies, for example, and they could feed those back to their funders and to decision makers. So we just say, look, recognize that this is a possibility. So I'm about to wrap up here, but our goal with advancing individual evaluation practice was that evaluators really need to take stock on how much they know in this area already and how much do they need to know, and to understand that if you're new to this field, you might even want to think about partnering. We have one case study, the Transportation Initiative, where they actually brought in a content expert in transportation policy to work with the evaluator. We also push on bridge building across different evaluation sectors. So there's not just the advocacy and policy change TIC, there's qualitative methods, there's the government evaluation, there's like 20 or more topical interest groups. And we say, you just keep cross-pollinating and bridge building because this arena doesn't have a topical focus area. So we might as well partner with the health evaluation folks. And that the more we share and we get our work out there, the more we inform practice, the more we build the field. And that also we're looking to continue to build that bridge between scholarship and evaluation. Because we do have a theory of change. That's a good place to think about the scholarship. But for many evaluators, they are not going to read through the literature on public policy. So that's it. I want to just say our thanks to our partners, because we couldn't have done it without partners, particularly Aspen Planning and Evaluation Program, the Center for Evaluation Innovation, our large community of advocacy and policy change evaluators. Of course, we tapped into the evaluation field, or the pioneers, and then of course to advocates and funders. So again, thank you for your attention.